Ilyas, thank you for coming in. You've got an amazing background. You've been in this field for a while. You have all of these marvelous contributions you've been making globally. So I really appreciate you coming in and sharing the insights with our audience.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to the conversation.
So Ilyas, my audience primarily is CEOs and investors, but I have professors in there as well. But they're always curious. What are those inflection points in your life, maybe two or three, that made this wonderful career you have and all the contributions you're making? And it could have been something that happened when you were 5 years old or early in school. It could have been a career move that you made. It could be some mentor and so on. So can you share maybe two or three of these inflection points?
Well, I think the journey on quantum, the inflection point, is Stephen Hawking. Without a shadow of a doubt, I was lucky enough I knew Stephen very well, but I was lucky enough then to be invited to be the inaugural chairman of something called the Stephen Hawking Foundation. And I got to know Stephen very well. And I think it was the environment at CMS, which is the Centre for Mathematical Studies in Cambridge. And in that particular environment, theoretical physics and mathematics are essentially, two sides of the same coin. The pure maths and the applied maths is how they teach it at Cambridge. So I was in this incredibly fertile environment, and you can't help but be affected by Stephen. I don't know whether you ever met him. Professor Hawking was a force of nature. That was the key inflection point, I think, both in terms of my intellectual life and also the prompt for getting involved in quantum computing.
I see. So have you worked with Roger Penrose as well?
No, I know Roger. I don't know him well, but I know Roger, obviously. And Stephen and Roger had this famous conversation going on over 4 decades. Maybe I should mention a slightly different inflection point that might be of interest to some of your listeners and people involved in this sort of diaspora that you've curated. I also was the founder of something called Accelerator Cambridge. There were 3 of us that founded an accelerator program for the university, and it was run through the Judge Business School. And the idea there was that Cambridge is probably the one place outside of the US, outside of Silicon Valley, outside of the Boston corridor, where successful technology companies have been built and who have come out of the university's ecosystem. But in Cambridge, we weren't scaling businesses. We were finding that deep science enterprises were really struggling very hard. They'd either give up or they'd sell out very early. So that accelerator program exposed me, and it was a very different model. I'm happy to talk to you about that if you're interested. But I then was exposed to these brilliant people and at the same time, great deep science ideas. And that inspired me to found what was then Cambridge Quantum. So those were the 2, I would say, inflection points that were more recent and that were more relevant to the quantum side.
So what really sparked your interest then in science? Did you have an early mentor when you were much younger, or maybe it was within your family? What ignited the spark in you in science?
I think so. I grew up in the northwest of England in Lancashire, and second generation immigrant family. And of course, education was it. And I was lucky enough to go to what was in those days called a grammar school. And that was my sort of escape route from what frankly was, pretty dire, grinding poverty, which was the environment in which I was raised. And I think, thank you for asking that question. Yeah, no, I was drawn into maths, and like so many of us, it was our teachers. And I think that early exposure and that early enthusiasm was there. It was always there, I think, but it probably was a spark. But I think that latent interest has remained something which is at the forefront of my life. In mathematics, my interest is in category theory. And category theory today is recognized as something which might even be foundational. I don't want to go so far as to say it is the foundation of mathematics, although I've written on this, but it is a very unique way of looking at the world. And Stephen, what it basically says is that instead of looking at things and going to the atomic level and reductionism and looking right down and trying to define something, the thing is defined not by what it is, but its relation with everything else. So a chair, I mean, you could say, oh, well, it's made of wood and, you can reduce, but actually a chair is something you sit on. So the relationship is between you and the chair. And so category theory as a form of mathematics was discovered or invented or created, depending upon your view, in relation to something called algebraic geometry. So it was these interests that have been there all the time and remain so. But I think with respect to quantum computing, it was definitely Stephen, and it was the exposure to Cambridge, and then the accelerator program.
So you mentioned, an inflection point was being the inaugural chairman of the Stephen Hawking Foundation, and you held that post until 2019. And can you share maybe one or two stories from that time period and working being affiliated with this foundation?
Well, I think the personality dominates, right? I mean, Stephen had Professor Hawking had he had a brain the size of a planet, and his very ever-present disability, his physical disability, never held him back. And so I think that the just the sheer joy of being in his presence and having that privilege is something that has left a deep mark on me. And his joie de vivre, the glass was always half full. I think it's impossible for any of us to imagine, those of us who are in good health, just what it takes to get through a single day. Towards the end of his life, he found it very difficult. And there are many people who are very close to him, including his family. But I had that privilege, and I think it was the human aspect of it that I think I would remember most. There were some retreats that he did, which were academic or intellectual retreats, really focusing on his interests. And I was lucky enough to be present at some places. But he'd lost the ability to lecture spontaneously certainly by 2017. It was hard going for him.
I mean, it's a very inspirational and catalytic story and narrative in terms of contributions to the world and so on. And I could see how that could be quite profound for you. But as you mentioned, though, you've done really interesting work. For example, leader in residence at the University of Cambridge Judge Business School, and you were instrumental in establishing this Accelerator Cambridge program. And that gets into translational research, right? So there's this tendency sometimes to researchers to live in a bubble and about publishing and so on. But then translational research, and that's what you were getting into, because when you're accelerating, then that means you're converting this into something that's practical. So can you tell the audience about that story and maybe some experiences with that program?
Oh gosh, well, the program itself was set up almost as a anti-reaction to some of the, should we say, commercial accelerators and incubators that were popping up at the time. And the idea here was that quite often it is exactly what you have said. It is the translation of an interesting idea beyond the concept into something that somebody else will value economically. The society we live in tends to commoditize everything. Everything is defined by its value. And perhaps that's been the case since, Stone Age man. A club was useful for the fact that it could, help you to get food or something. And the commodity, the exchange was the animal that you've killed. So, worth in a deep science setting can be very difficult, because on the one hand, you have the passion of the inventor, but then you have this huge wide world who's like, well, so what? You know, that's very cool, but so what? And it's the so what that we were trying to tackle. In my own experience at Cambridge Quantum and now Quantinuum, I have to say to you that for the first 3 or 4 years, we were the first startup in the world. We were the first mover. And on the algorithm side, I mean, D-Wave had been around, and then within IBM, within Microsoft, within Google, there were quantum programs. I think the Google quantum program pipped me by a month or two. But outside in the real world, I think for the first 2 or 3 years, Stephen, it really was, for me, a question of saying, well, we're going to stick with this program because we are convinced that we're now in an engineering challenge and not a profound scientific challenge. No more Nobel Prizes need to be won in order to create a quantum computer. And that challenge, I'll answer now directly your question. I found that it was the alignment of capital, people who actually weren't going to push you the next day for a result, or the next week, or the next quarter, with that understanding of just how important this technology is. It is not just another deep tech science. This is an industrial revolution. And we were lucky that we found that. There are many deep science projects that are probably very, very good, but they don't align with the runway that is needed to get them to that stage.
So, so I want to tie this again into your Accelerate Cambridge program of investment in early stage Cambridge-based deep science technology sector companies. So was Cambridge Quantum a spin-out from that program?
Well, first of all, Cambridge Quantum was a spin-out from the university program. It was I can go into the spin-out itself if you like. It was an incredible technology which was invented by Professor Adrian Kent, and it was to do with quantum key distribution, which of course is going to affect everything in the future. We were 10 years too early. But we still have that technology, and funnily enough, the first commercial implementation is going to be either in December or January. It is. I don't want to keep saying profound. I can't think of another word. It affects everything. I mean, if people get excited about cryptocurrencies and distributed ledgers and these things, the thing that Professor Kent invented goes back to the 70s. The question is raised is, what if money could be represented not by a piece of paper in those days, or in our world digitally, in some ledger or record which is kept in a bank, but what if it was truly quantum? What if it was represented by a token which was quantum? Of course, if it was, then you solve all of these problems of simultaneity, non-centrality, security, etc., etc. So Professor Kent was the one that worked on this, and we, Cambridge Quantum, acquired that, and then the university had a share in it, and we spun out. But and we were the beneficiaries of the Accelerate Cambridge program, but it was a little bit incestuous because I was still quite an important force there. So you can't really mentor yourself. And we also were never short of money. I had done rather well in a previous startup, and so the first few £1 million were from me. But going back to the Accelerator program, I think the word spin out is probably, it's a very American terminology, I think, and it doesn't it doesn't map one-to-one. It's slightly different. And so I would just say that we had people that went through the program, and we had a very high success rate. And what we said was, so you apply to the program, and we will give you the money that you need. We think that you need. It won't be everything that you need, but we won't take equity. It's your money. If you're successful, pay us back. Pay us back whatever you think we deserve. Now, it's very anti like if you said this to some incubator, accelerator, VC angel in, I don't know, in Palo Alto, they'd probably throw up over their porridge. But it worked in Cambridge. And very early on, we had 3 or 4 successes, and the founders gave back. Now, the program has moved on. It's no longer set up on, it's now 13 years since the program was established, 12 years, I'm sorry. So it has moved on. But in those first 4 or 5 days, I insisted that we don't take the role of an equity investor and therefore just change this expectation. We were truly facilitating these entrepreneurs and these researchers.
That's really interesting. And so you alluded to this, you had another sort of earlier exit. So I just want to spend a few minutes on that, because clearly you were successful because you were able to invest in Cambridge Quantum, right? So initially at its founding, just spend a couple of minutes talking about this other startup.
Oh. It's quite embarrassing. I was a kid. Well, this was in the mid-90s. So when I say the mid-90s, in my mind, it feels like yesterday. But of course, it wasn't yesterday. It was 30 years ago now, almost 30 years ago. So I was very inspired by Guy Kawasaki. And Guy, of course, is very well known in the United States, less well known outside. And I bought his book called The Macintosh Way, which I don't know if you remember. Stephen.
I mean, I know Guy.
Oh, you know Guy, okay. So, well, there you go. And I love his remarkable podcast. They're very interesting. Yeah, so Guy set up this thing called garage.com.
Right.
And I was living in Hong Kong at the time, and I just thought, wow, I had nothing that Guy had. And of course, Hong Kong does not have that deep ecosystem. In fact, I'm not even sure there was a domestic venture capital firm there. So I set up something called Tech Pacific, and we were very interested in the way in which, this was just about the time that the internet was becoming better known. And that was the business that I started. Through that, I was lucky enough to be one of the founders of something called White Energy, which I'll give you a sentence on, but we mustn't let this podcast be dominated by this. But this was an invention in the Second World War, when the Australians thought that they were going to have to power aeroplanes using coal. If you can imagine having a coal-fired aeroplane. Anyway, they were worried that that we'd be cut off from oil supplies. And I think it's a CSRO in Australia. It's an agency that kept these patents. And I was approached by this Aussie lawyer, actually, who said, look, we can use the same technology to dry very wet coal. And instead of it being spontaneously combustible and blowing everything up, we can actually burn it for power close to the place at which it's being mined. And so very high moisture coal that could be low moisture and high energy value is almost a holy grail. So that company did very well. And Tech Pacific, of course, did very well. And so that was my entrepreneurial sort of episode. But I have to say, Quantinuum, it's a different scale. Quantinuum is just, as I'm sure you know, but that was therefore my second startup.
Okay, now let's get into your Cambridge Quantum to Quantinuum story. So how did this merger come about between Honeywell Quantum Solutions and Cambridge Quantum? How did you first meet? Did they approach you? Did you approach them? You met at a conference? I mean, what's the story behind this amazing company, Quantinuum?
So Cambridge Quantum was started, as I now know, at roughly the same time that Honeywell Quantum Solutions decided that they had the prerequisites for building a quantum processor. And my engagement with Honeywell was by complete accident. We had done one of the things that the United Kingdom has been extremely good at is that it is now a leader globally in quantum computing. And really uniquely, for the first time since the Second World War, really since the Manhattan Project, the United States finds itself not at the forefront of a global technology revolution. And it is obviously catching up very, very fast. And the government program, the congressional bill has changed things. But if you go back to 2013, the United Kingdom, 2014, 2013, there were only two national programs. There was a Chinese program and there was a British program. And the British program benefited from the fact that in the tertiary education system, quantum information theory had been taught. In fact, the Oxford group led by Bob Kuka, Professor Kuka, was at the time the biggest group in the world in looking at this, which is quite something. So if you look at Caltech and Harvard and MIT and Stanford and Berkeley and Yale, these programs were largely experimental, and there was not this governmental recognition that there is today. Today, there's not a country of significance that isn't focused on quantum because it changes everything. So back in 2014, one of the government programs was asking us at Cambridge Quantum to devise a compiler. So some of your audience who is familiar with computer science will recognize and realize that at the heart of any system, if you think of these von Neumann sort of architectures, so it's a Turing machine that works, instead of a human being writing things down. So this architecture has a compiler which allows us, therefore, to access the computational power that we need to access. Now, the compiler for a classical machine versus a quantum machine is a very different thing. So we came up with what was at the time, I think it was the first compiler. Before that, Stephen, everything was manual. People were sort of inputting looking at this algorithm, and quantum algorithms are fairly strange creatures. And you've got to try and unpack that. So what does that mean in terms of a gate-based implementation? So quantum logic gates. So quantum logic is very different from classical logic. So we did a compiler where if you had an algorithm, it was compiled into a gate-based sort of circuit, which could then be implemented. And the first machine we did this on in Oxford was for a quantum computer that had ion traps as qubits. So we got close to the metal. Now, fast forward, as we all now know, what was the machine that Honeywell was building? It was an ion trap machine. And the biggest problem with trapped ions still is, except not for us, they're beautiful ions, they're great qubits, they can achieve everything that we want them to achieve. But the question is, how on earth does it scale? And so when I encountered Honeywell, I think it was very early 2018 or late 2017, I was blown away by the fact that they had apparently solved the problem. It was really, really interesting. And we then started working in stealth. We weren't allowed to tell anybody on seeing if our compiler could energize and really make real, this is your point earlier, how do you make a pile of metal into something that's relevant? 2019, Honeywell then invested a small amount in our company alongside IBM. So IBM invested in Cambridge Quantum, Honeywell invested in Cambridge Quantum. And then the Honeywell program just grew and grew. And in early 2021, I was approached by Honeywell's chairman, Darius Adamczyk, and he asked me whether we should merge our two companies. And I have to say, saying yes was the best decision I ever made. And they asked me to be the inaugural CEO, as you know, and we've not looked back. and they are an incredible partner. Honeywell has been a dream partner.
I mean, and Honeywell is really famous for integration of different sort of components and, managing these kind of programs, or managing these kind of different disparate pieces of gear, so to speak, to do something, right? So can you talk a little bit more about Quantinuum, and as you mentioned, the basis of its technology, how you're addressing the coherence issue, and your scaling that you're doing right now? And then we'll get into some practical applications you're actually trying to address today and not 5 or 10 years from now. So,
well, I have to say, I think that the commercial impact on things that matter to human beings, I think that if luckily for all of us, we now have a reference point. So if somebody says to me, when will the chat GPT moment arrive for quantum? Where are we in that regard? I do believe that it is a couple of years away. I don't think it's 2024 or 2025 or maybe 2026. I mean, I think that global wow, everything's changed, will happen very, very soon. And 2 or 3 years is really not very long, as you know. However, something very big will happen in the next 6 to 8 months, and that is that we Quantinuum, will have a quantum computing a device. Let's call it a quantum processor. And I don't like the word processor, so I end up using machine, because a processor brings to mind lots of classical analogies, but a quantum computer that cannot be simulated classically. At the moment, everything that's on the market, our machine, IBM's machine, the Google machine, all of these devices can be simulated classically on a laptop or some concatenation of GPUs or whatever. When that happens, when we have a computer, a quantum computer that cannot be simulated, we're in new territory. And I believe we're less than 8 months away. It will be a Quantinuum machine. Nobody else is even close to getting that out. That changes everything.
And the basis of that technology, then, can you explain sort of fundamentally, what's making this work?
Yeah, so we have, at its most basic bit, for your listeners who perhaps aren't as familiar with quantum computing, the analogy I would use is, let's go back to the early days of automobiles, and you have this ability to create a combustion engine, the combustibility that pushed the piston up, right? So the combustion engine. So it's wonderful terminology we forget. And there were then kind of people stopped. It was like, how do you convert that into something that turns wheels on a practical chassis? So in quantum computing, we're at that stage where people are thinking about what is the species that will be the qubit. Because remember, a qubit, the equivalent of a classical bit, is something physical. Information is embedded in something which is either an atom or a photon, or sometimes a subatomic particle like an electron. And there's a debate, a very rich debate, about which modality is going to work. So you could have had a combustion engine which was powered by burning the waste material of a cow, right? I mean, theoretically. So we're at that stage now where everybody's looking at different modalities. And the last 3 years has seen an incredible acceleration because of vast amounts of capital. And people forget just how much capital has been committed globally through corporates or governments. We at Quantinuum have planted our flag as an integrated company. We have every aspect of the stack. We've been described, as you may know, as the Apple of quantum computing. And because we're integrated, we can calibrate, we can say, well, how does that work? Now, we have our own quantum computer, which is where our qubit is an ion, an atom. Let's just call it an atom, because I think your audience is very broad and wide, and we don't want to get too technical here. But we use a single atom, which is pretty mind-bogglingly small, but that is how we power our machine. There are other people using different modalities. Some people use photons, or they're trying to use photons. Other people use superconducting materials. And we here have got to the point where we've solved a very big problem. And that problem is we've got a machine with sufficient numbers of these qubits. And when we talk about numbers of qubits, we mean those that actually work. Quite often people say, oh, I've got 1,000 qubits or 500 qubits. Well, that's really not very useful information, because unless they do something together, it's the something they do that matters, not the number that matters. So we've got to the point qualitatively where, because of our integrated approach and the quality of our qubits, our next device cannot be simulated by a classical computer. You can't create something and then see how it might work. Now, why does that matter? So I'll give you one example. You know, we I think since the 1950s have been building, and this accelerated in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, something called particle accelerators. So high energy physics or particle physics is a preoccupation of many governments and universities for all kinds of great reasons. Scientific discovery, the nature of reality, but also, you know, how the world works, how the universe works. Now, all of these are done in experiments that cost billions of dollars, because you can't simulate what happens. You have to wait and see. Well, of course, these are physical systems. They're at the quantum level, and a quantum computer, our next generation, will mean that those facilities that spend millions, if not hundreds of millions, on supercomputers that don't do very much, will be able to use a quantum computer that does more. And ultimately, we may not need to build particle accelerators. If we have a powerful enough quantum computer, it really opens, you know, it unveils this entry point into the nature of reality. So the applications from that, of course, I'll talk about in a minute, but this is a big stepping stone over the course of the next year, and we will be allowing universities, national labs, access to this computer, because for them this is essential and very important.
So you're indicating that you got sort of a handle on this kind of coherence and error correction issue, and you've got entanglement and superposition and so on in a way, and you're using ions, and you got an ion trap. And how are you confining or managing that? Lasers, or what are you using to manage these fundamental atoms?
Yes, so I think I just want to correct, well, not correct, but just go back. I think that the journey, which involves error correction and getting qubits that are stable enough and good enough to do the deep circuits that are required, I'd like to talk about a little bit separately. I don't think anybody has a handle on that, because you still first got to get your native qubits to a certain level before you can start doing these other things. Every machine you and I have got, I mean, this machine here, my telephone, has error correcting processes, if you like, built into the architecture. So I'd like to come back to that. I think we believe we are significantly ahead of anybody else in terms of creating a logical qubit. And I'll come back to that if I may, because that's quite important. But yes, the answer to the rest of your question is yes. And everything from the engineering which creates the qubit to the electronic control systems that allow you to interact with the system and measure and therefore have results, all the way through to access so that people can do things with these devices and not quick. Do you remember the early modem days when you plugged in and you just about typed hello and then it, the telephone line went? So how do you get from that to this, what you and I are doing on Zoom? So that all of that had to come together, and specifically if you think you've got to generate a qubit, you've got to manipulate it, and then you've got to measure it. That's what quantum computing is about. Generate a qubit, manipulate it, and then measure it. In the manipulate bit, lasers are absolutely critical. And so, yes, to your point about that as well, very specialized machinery. I'm speaking to you from Colorado. So our center of the manufacturing side and the engineering side of what we do is here in Colorado at a place called Broomfield. And we also have a sister facility in Minnesota, in Golden Valley. So we have these twin centers where we do all of this magic that has led to the building of the device. And this goes back to my earlier point, which is in 2013, 2014, 2015, it would have been difficult to see how the United States was competing. Here we are today in 2023, and the best machine in the world is here in the United States, which I think is an incredible. Sorry, and I know you didn't ask me this, but going back to the VC side, this is an industry which has largely bypassed the VC communities here.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating, and so you're indicating that you're getting to the point where you can't have an exascale supercomputer somehow running some quantum simulation that approximates or quantum inspired algorithm that can do what your system can do. Your system is going to be beyond any kind of, or even Zetta scale, perhaps, right? Zetta scale will be 1 trillion billion operations per second. We already have El Capitan coming out next year. We've got Frontier already out this year, which can do 1 billion billions, an exascale supercomputer. So what you're proposing then, within a year, you're going to have a system that none of the, even Zetta scale, will be able to do, because you've gone to this next sort of stratospheric breakthrough.
Yeah, I'm yes, short answer, but I'm wary of these. We get so used to thinking about speed, and if not speed, then this parallelism and the re-architecturing of the semiconductor but what we sometimes forget is that no matter what we do, there are computational complexity bounds to what any Turing machine can do, what any classical computer can do. And one of those bounds, it doesn't matter what we do, is simulating a quantum system beyond a few atoms. Maybe you've got some molecule that is made up of whatever menu of atoms with different electrons. When you start to simulate that and what happens to that system, if you're trying to do drug discovery or something, no amount of classical compute gets you there. It just doesn't, because of this complexity. And it's not about parallelization or anything like that. Although, of course, we have to speak to each other. And we have to try and explain why things are different. So speed does come into it. But actually, one thing is intractable, i.e., simulating a quantum system, whereas in another, it's not tractable. So a quantum computer just does things that are different. And finally, after many years of anticipation, we do think in fact, I'd go one step further. We will have a quantum computer that for certain things, so for example, in high energy physics, in condensed matter physics, and these are things that matter to humanity, in those areas, it will not be capable of being recreated or it will not be competitive to do it classically. Now, that doesn't mean that we're suddenly watching YouTube videos or doing language processing on a quantum computer, because that's what I said earlier conversation, I think certain real world applications at scale are still a few years away. But this area of breakthrough alone is worth the effort. If Feynman was alive today, oh my God, he'd be like, wow. Well, if Einstein was alive today, I mean, these are the kind of things, because if you look back over, I don't know, the sweep of history, I mean, Stephen Hawking was very fond of saying these things. He says them more articulately than I can in his books. Every advance that we as a species have ever seen is sparked by a technical change. It might be fire, it might be the wheel, it might be steam, but it is equivalent to that, what we're talking about. This is a humanity-wide shift that is, we're about to see.
So you mentioned particle physics, which is really interesting, and there's practical outcomes from that. But condensed matter physics in particular, there's practical ramifications of that, because condensed matter physics it's behind superconductors, it's behind semiconductors. So right. if you can solve that in a way that classical computers cannot, which is what you're saying, then it has enormous ramifications. Can you go further on that, on the practical side, right?
Yeah. I think people get very excited. Well, at the moment, everybody's preoccupied with language processing, and I think the dream of having a computer that is human-like, not just smarter at adding things up and taking things away and multiplying them, or finding connections between things and jumping to conclusions about patterns and predictions. And rightly, I think we're preoccupied with these things that make machines human-like. But actually, I think there are some very practical issues that will be more important in the short, medium, and long term. And as a consequence of that, I think, we might have computers that are human-like. I'm not a believer really in AGI. I find the whole thing slightly woo-woo-ish. And I'm very frustrated by the language sometimes that some of the leaders of the LLM companies, it's a black box. But your point, I think, if I may now just, in condensed matter physics and in particle physics, I think the heuristic or the guesswork or the trial and error is what gets resolved. Most of what we've done in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries leading into the 21st century is trial and error. Very refined, very good, and we build on things that we found. If we had the ability to unveil, look beyond the veil at the molecular, the submolecular level, then we don't have to guess. And you spoke about semiconductors and superconducting. I mean, I think those are two areas where I think whole industries will shift. People, I routinely speak to people who are making vast amounts of investments in things that are related to the Chip Act, etc. And condensed matter physics will, changes in the way in which we can create new materials. Let's just focus on that for a minute. Has such an impact there that anybody who's making those decisions, either at the government level or at the corporate level, if they're doing it without understanding what's happening in quantum computing, is making a mistake. Now, the problem that we've had is up until recently, most people have said, oh, yeah, it's 10 years away. Oh, yeah. And rightly so, because we're evidence-based. People say, show me the meat, show me the thing. And that is what I'm saying. Over the course of the next 6, 8, 12 months, a quantum computer that is doing something which classical computers cannot. It might not do it perfectly, but it is doing it. That is a game changer. Now, the applications of that, what we're trying to think about in the short term, because you need an application, you need to interact with that capability. So if I gave you a rocket and you just kept it in your garden, it's not going to help you with your shopping, it's not going to help you with your washing, and you may not want to go to Mars or the moon, right? So it's got to be practical. So what we're thinking of doing is creating an interface with the research community of the world, corporate and academic, initially in particle physics. And so they have a practical application like Lotus 123, if you like, an application that allows them at a primitive level to begin to think about how to use that tool. And as you and I both know, once you give them these tools, the quantum computer and the application, smart people, way smarter than me, I dare say you, these people will find a way of using it. So I'm a little bit cautious about trying to predict how it will be used, but for sure, it will be absolutely transformational.
And then, there's Monte Carlo simulation and using that in financial markets. It can be applied in also in physics, but also in all sorts of business applications. I believe you've done something in that area, right? In quantum Monte Carlo. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So, well, first of all, Monte Carlo simulations are at the heart of so many industrial applications and financial applications. We use them without knowing that we're using them. They're critical parts of the infrastructure that we deploy. So if you're at a bank or at a financial institution, Monte Carlo, the use of Monte Carlo methodologies are, well, they're core and central. And it's been known for some time now that that we do need to think about, well, let me take a step back. About 3 years ago, research was done that showed that a quantum computer could make things better in the quantum Monte Carlo sort of industry, if you like, from optimization through to pricing. The use cases are many. The question was, how do you prove that that is the case from theory? And what is the methodology that will allow a bank to use it without having to hire 30 PhDs in quantum computing? So at the moment, they plug in information and out pops an answer. So I want to give you a quick example. Let's say I'm a shareholder or I have some shares in, I don't know, in Apple, and I want to buy an option to a call option that is a 2-year call option. What should be its price? So that, of course, is a Monte Carlo exercise, and out pops an answer. And then you have your answer, and then you do something with it. So we are trying to create that end-to-end solution. So somebody puts in the question, what is the right price for a option? And out pops an answer, and they don't have to have all this quantum computing expertise. And what you're referring to is that for the first time ever, we have an A to Z toolkit, and it shows that it will be better, i.e. more accurate and faster than classical methodologies. We do not yet have the quantum computers that could run that program, but we're now not in the territory of guesswork. How far away are we from implementing that? I think in portfolio optimization, I think we're actually probably less than 3 years away. I think we're probably about 3 years away, maybe 4 or 5 at the outset. And that really is a big statement. And now coming back, I don't want to scare people, but how much money has been invested in infrastructure classically to do stuff like that, which will be done better quantumly? And those people that are like, oh, yeah, come and tell me when it's happened. It's too late. When it's already happened, you're competent. And that's what we're finding, particularly in the United States. Large financial organizations are beginning to realize that.
I mean, a number of years ago, I was approached by these 100 CEOs representing about 92.7 trillion. And these are like JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America and so on, to sort of help them look 10 years into the future. So I mentioned you've got to double down on quantum computing. And this is quite some time ago. And JP Morgan is invested in this. And it's interesting. And what you're doing, they would, I mean, they must be integrated with what you're doing or knocking on your door anyways, or all of them actually, because the implications are so profound. And it's not, I remember when I suggested quantum computing and people were saying, well, Stephen, that's ridiculous. That's 100 years out. We're talking 2100. I said, no, you're not talking 2100. I said, those outliers are going to be in the scape within the next 10 years. And you've got to start looking at it because it takes time to build the expertise and the team to be able to utilize these tech, right? And it's like my interview with Tony, where he said, you know, you're working on 3 quantum technologies at the same time in parallel. And he says, and generation 2 is 1 trillion times better than generation 1. And generation 3 is 1 trillion, and you're really working on 3 at the same time, because you've got to be able to have this sort of overlap as you roll out these subsequent technologies. And so I think that's a really, really profound. Do you think that we'll ever get to this point where, you know, there's this idea of P is not equal to MP? In other words, deterministic kind of computing is not the same thing as non-deterministic computing, and it'll never be the same. But because of the profound nature of what you're doing, or some of the work that's been done in analog computing, and or even the new kind of semiconductors, you know, pristine graphene, do you think we're going to reach a point where this idea of P is not equal to MP? In other words, these sort of what we think is non-deterministic will now become deterministic because of this enormous, almost unbelievable capability of understanding and working with nature, which is really what Quantinuum is doing, right? You're being able to harness nature. And a lot of the problems out there are nature. And if you can harness nature and to solve nature problems, then it'll be an inflection point in humanity. So that's what you're doing with Quantinuum. Or am I wrong?
Well, you know, P equals MP or doesn't equal MP. Well, currently, you know, it hasn't been. The question is, does P equal MP? And lots of amazing minds are working and have been working on that. And the consensus, of course, is that we operate on the basis that P does not equal MP. But look, I think that it's a really good question, and it happens to be a deep interest of mine. So I'll give you a short answer. I think that the bounds of computational complexity, I think, will remain intact. I think that there will be things that if we're given the answer, we can check that it is correct. So MP things like factoring. So we could have this enormous number with 2,000 digits. And I could tell you, here are the prime factors, and you'll be able to check that that is correct simply on a calculator. Whereas if I just gave you the number and said, what are the prime factors? There's no machine on the planet that could do that. You know, it would take them 1 billion years at a certain level of size of number. Do I think that a quantum computer will get us to the point where that type of problem is solved? I think that Shor's algorithm, which, as you know, Stephen, which presages all of this, is likely to be achieved. Yes, we'll get there in bits. Bigger and bigger numbers will become available. So, in theory, solving NP hard problems, or problems that can't be solved with a classical computer in this P, there is this other, which is the quantum P, if you like, BQP. I think we'll get to that stage, yes. Whether we solve problems that are right at the boundary of MP, i.e. MP hard, traveling salesman, when you've got 500 nodes rather than 10, I don't think so. But I think what will happen, which I think is much, much more important, or no, I should say as important, is that same reason why we can start moving beyond the current boundaries. And of course, we talked about chemistry and material simulation. That amalgam of two capabilities changes everything. So whilst I don't think we should worry too much about or spend too much time about NP hard solutions, I don't think that's likely using a quantum computer. And I'm in the mainstream here. I mean, people like Scott Aronson and Simone Severini and others, these people have written about this. Well, John Preskill, of course, and many others. So I think they're right. I think that NP hard is not achievable using a quantum computer. Now, what you said, something very interesting, computing the way nature computes. Now that's a whole different thing. Oh my God. And that, I think, if people are listening to this and there's only one takeaway, I think that's the takeaway. A quantum computer is not contrived. It's not a Turing machine. We're not doing these sort of if this then that type. We're not restricted to this contrived first order logic. It's very good. I mean, it's what human beings do, and it's what has helped us get this far. But imagine using logic in the way that nature uses logic, which is at the quantum level. And I think you're spot on there, Stephen. I think that is the beauty and the power and the sheer enormity of what we're going to be doing.
So, Ilyas, I'm going to do a time check. We had allocated an hour. Are you bound by that hour, or can we go?
I'm kind of bound, but not. I mean, I'm bound, but I a few more minutes would be great. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I definitely recommend the audience looking at what you're doing. I mean, you are the largest integrated quantum computing company in the world because of this integration and just the powerful capabilities of Cambridge Quantum coming together with Honeywell Quantum Solutions has created this a tremendous entity and capability, right, of integrated quantum computing. So, excuse me, and I think what you're doing is really interesting. I just want to go to a couple more questions and then, being respectful of time. You are the founding chairman of Topos Institute, where you're looking at practical science for societal good. And you talked about that earlier, about when you did this Accelerate Cambridge program. You were thinking about sort of the broader implications of doing good as well, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is a mission which is close to my heart. The Topos Institute is all about the use of technology for the good of humanity as a whole. And this question has become topical because of large language models. And so maybe I can say two things. I'm not quite sure which the direction of travel is. I'm deeply involved in this. I'll in fact, in a couple of weeks' time, there's a conference that's been organized by the government of Singapore, which is all about the safety of AI. And we're not yet at the point where when one person says safe AI, that the other 10 who are listening will necessarily know what safe means. It means different things to different people. So my approach here is that it's understandable why we are fascinated by and are using generative AI models in our day-to-day lives. At the moment, mostly at the consumer level, but perhaps at some point at scale in the industrial level. However, there's a big however. I believe that unless we know how a decision was made, we will never get beyond the current generation. It will remain a triviality. It will be in the history books. We'll look back and we'll say, oh yeah, that was really good. And then what? So we need to get to the point where if you're in a hospital or you're in a legal context or you are in a bank or you are in a company which has obligations to millions of customers, if something is generated by this language model, or let's call it a system, then you need to know why that answer came. At the moment, you cannot. And what distresses me is so many of the leaders of these large companies, wonderful entrepreneurs, amazing businessmen, fantastic technology, we airbrush over this. We try and do post-processing. We kind of I was talking to one of these guys, and he spoke to me, and he said, "Well, you can interpret what I said. You don't need to know why. You know what I said." And I think reducing it to these things is, we're better than that as humanity. So one aspect of safety is interpretability, knowing why an answer came. So these large neural networks, as you know, once you get to a certain size, there's no way of knowing why an answer came. So that's one aspect of safety, interpretability. There's another aspect of safety, which I'm very keen on, which is causal cognition. You and I, all humanity, if we're trying to get to the point where these devices, these systems they've got better memories than you and I, they can associate with past history. So, for example, in playing chess or in playing Go, whatever, and we can harness this power for our good, we then have to be aware of causality. We can't just pretend it doesn't exist. And this is a very, very complex area, even in human cognition. Causality is another one of these foundational issues. And the way we resolve this is using something called compositional systems. Because if you have compositionality, you then can also be interpretable and accountable. You don't have to have a black box. So my personal interest in this area, on the one hand, is obviously the use of technology, so not half a dozen people become trillionaires and the rest of us not. That just isn't interesting for me. And what is interesting is so my children and their children are not going to accept what we accepted. There's got to be guardrails. All the ills of the current systems, all the stuff we're aware of, but we're not allowed to speak about. So people who commit suicide and have racism and all the other stuff that goes on these platforms, and the platforms say, "Oh, well, that's not us, that's not our fault." And if it was in a newspaper, the newspaper would get shut down, right? We know all of these things. So how can we do better in the next generation of technology? So at the moment, nobody knows the answer, but my focus is looking at compositional systems as the next generation, and how do we industrialize them so they can work at scale and at the same time be interpretable and at the same time be accountable, and we know what the causality is.
It's interesting. I'm just going to inject an idea. Judea Pearl has come out with a causal mathematical model, which could be employed, and he's been advocating for it for probably 15 years, right? So, and he won the Turing Award for his work, and people are not, or he is suggesting that people need to look deeper at what he's done. So just one more question, and that is, what are your recommendations to the audience? And then that's the close of our interview.
When you say recommendation, you mean reading?
Any recommendation, lasting thoughts or final?
Oh, right. I see. Yeah, no, but Judea Pearl's work is obviously, I think, important. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And for those of you, I don't know when this comes out, but at the end of January, there's a causal cognition conference, which I think is under the auspices of AMS. It's being held in Oxford, and I think it'll be the first time that I'm aware of that we're bringing together people that are involved in human causal and so in cognition in human terms, and causality on the other side, and then applying that and looking at machine intelligence. So I like the work that Judea Pearl is doing, and I think a lot more work needs to be done there. Yeah, I guess my recommendation is there's a lot of information about quantum computing out there. It need not be frightening, and to the extent that you can educate yourselves by looking at these resources, I'll mention 2 or 3. I think the Microsoft website about quantum is really good, really accessible. IBM's is fantastic. Ours is not bad, Quantinuum, but in terms of public resources, just YouTube videos and stuff like that, I think it's actually a really good resource.
Well, thank you again, Ilyas, for coming in. I should mention you're also a fellow of St. Edmund's College at Cambridge, and just a marvelous career. So the audience should follow your work and what you're doing at Quantinuum as well. Just exciting and tremendously profound. So thank you again for coming in.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.